In Chapter 3, I spent some time demonstrating how the law always treated crimes against women very seriously, and how it always punished male perpetrators severely. In response, some feminists will try to argue that these criminal statutes were not concerned as much with protecting women as they were with reinforcing patriarchal male property interests. And you'll see this in some of the literature. I've read law review articles to that effect. I believe that that analysis is completely and entirely incorrect. For one thing, if you go back and read some of these old cases where men were tried and convicted for abusing women, what you'll find is that the emphasis was on the harm that was done to the female victim, not on some male property interest. This misdiagnosis comes into play, though, because there are other areas of the law where the law does try to compensate aggrieved males. And I'm thinking now specifically of the civil actions known as the heart-balm actions. This was alienation of affections, criminal conversation, breach of promise to marriage, seduction. Seduction, of course, later became a crime in the 1800s, a crime that only applied to men. I did a whole video on that. You can check that video out if you want. But essentially, these were civil actions that tried to compensate men who were damaged financially by the actions of other men. So, for instance, if you had a man who seduced a woman into adultery, the law tried to compensate the husband. If you had a man who slept with a woman who was unmarried but previously chaste, the law tried to compensate her father. And obviously that was because a woman back then who was not a virgin, it was much harder for her. Her marriage prospects were diminished. And that meant that her father might be responsible for her financially for the rest of her life. So the law tried to compensate these aggrieved men. Now, any so-called property interests that these men had in women, they were very closely related to the male duty to provide resources for women and children. And it's so important to understand this principle, and this is why I've re-emphasized it in almost every chapter and in many of these videos that I do. If you don't understand society's expectation that men will provide resources for women and children, it's much harder to understand our law, our history, our culture, even our religion. I've recalled many occasions where atheists tried to argue that in the Old Testament of the Bible, men could abuse women as long as they paid the woman's father. Well, this is just a complete misunderstanding and a very unsophisticated reading of ancient legal codes. But again, this goes back to a failure to understand the male duty to provide resources. So it's important to understand that principle, but the bottom line here is this. The law has always taken the abuse of women very seriously and punished men very severely for it. And the only reason that some activists are trying to argue otherwise is they're trying to undermine these important due process protections that we have in the law. And that's why it's so important to challenge this false narrative.